Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where we will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that we can move through our pain to get to the kind of healthy relationships we want, need, and deserve. I'm your host, licensed psychotherapist, Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm based out of Oakland, California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Hello and welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here with me today. I have a very special guest planned. I feel like all my guests are special, so I know I say that every time, and I really, truly believe that. But for today's show, I'm bringing on a very special guest to talk about inner critic. And I feel that talking about our inner critic is so very important, especially for those that have a history of being in abusive and toxic relationships, because when we are in environments that are so very oppressive, so very harmful to our spirit, a lot of times without even realizing it, we incorporate our abuser or our oppressor's voice inside of our own inner dialogue or our own inner commentary. And that voice shapes a lot of what we do, who we are attracted to, or just how we see things in the world and just how we treat ourselves too. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about, again, the inner critic and who helps shape that. Why is this so important, and how can we overcome it if we have a negative inner critic, especially if we're still in a very abusive or oppressive environment? And I brought on the perfect guest to do that, and she does a lot of work around that with her clientele. And so I think that you're going to find this informative for a number of reasons. I even found it informative in terms of doing the interview because, there's so many things that we do in our life where we don't celebrate our wins, where we don't acknowledge ourselves, or we put other people before us, or we honor others' well-being before we honor our own. And it could be something even such as your job, where you don't take off time from work for your job, or you don't acknowledge yourself and the wonderful work that you do. And again, it just shows up in so many different ways, and it helps us to, our inner critic really helps to shape just how we treat ourselves. And if we're not careful, that's not very good. We could end up treating ourselves very much, or talking to ourselves very much like our abuser or our oppressors. And then, it gets kind of tricky when you have abuse or oppressive coming from various angles. That could be from societal oppression. It could be from your own culture, from your own city. We've been talking a lot about, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is not a political movement, but it actually is a civil justice. It is a civil right movement. So those other things like that could also take have an impact, essentially. And so without further ado, I want to get right into it with my very special guest, and I will let her do the introductions. Hello and welcome to the show, Dr. D. How are you?
I'm doing well. Happy to speak with you today.
Awesome, right? So this is a very special podcast episode. 1, because you're on. 2, because this is a do-over because I messed up yesterday.
But it's
somehow
all right.
lost the original one. So you've been gracious enough to come on twice and talk about the same thing, but nevertheless, I know it's going to be a good show. So without further ado, can you tell my listeners who you are, what you do, and what drives the passion behind your work?
So my name is Maria Mercedes Dominguez. I go by Dr. D professionally. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also do coaching and consulting work. The core of any of the work I do, whether it's on the teaching side or the clinical side, it is empowerment and resilience. And so I really am about creating and cultivating that in every person I connect with.
Great. And you do a lot of work around the inner critic, right?
Yes,
And
ma'am.
so, for people who don't know what that is, can you tell us what the inner critic is, how it's formed, and how it impacts us?
Yes. The inner critic is a human phenomenon. It is a thought form. It is something that has been studied across multiple cultures in multiple countries. And what psychologists have learned is that many times it is the internalized ideas, expectations, standards of the environments, of the social environments we're in. So we see in more collectivistic cultures, the inner critic criticizes us more for maybe standing out or thinking we're special, or the who do you think you are. In more individualistic cultures, we see the inner critic telling us you're not special enough. You don't have anything unique to offer. What is that about? And so it is that voice that's really echoes of the voices all around us. It's echoes of the media, but because it is echoing within us, we confuse it for our own voice. So what the treatment process for that is practicing that discernment and learning how to filter out the messages that you have received from your environment, from your relationships, to what you truly believe within your core.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for breaking that down for us. And for people of color, can you tell us a little bit more about how their inner critic is shaped, or other layers of their inner critic, so to
Yes.
speak? Yeah.
Yes. So I work predominantly with people of African descent or Latinx people. And I have found that the inner critic is also racialized for us in marginalized communities. And so we have colorism that plays a role. We have xenophobia that plays a role. We have our languages, the way that we speak, the accents that we may have, that plays a role in how that inner critic is developed and what the inner critic focuses on and what it doesn't. We also have the role that our economic background and socioeconomic status plays. And so based on our experiences and the history that our families have traveled through, those kind of beliefs and standards are instilled and passed down from one generation to the next. And they're also reinforced by the reality of the now. And so there's those extra layers that I work through with my clients, and being able to recognize, like, okay, that sounds more like white supremacy. That sounds more like we are prioritizing money over the value of life. That sounds more like all of these other things, and just being able to recognize the social influences on our inner thoughts.
Absolutely. And, part of, the gist behind this podcast is that I work with, or that it's geared towards people that are in abusive relationships. And I think this work around the inner critic is so valuable, because there are so many people that are in abusive relationships that even when they leave or they're out of that relationship for whatever reason, they still have that very harsh inner voice. Can you talk a little bit about the inner critic for someone who's in an abusive or an oppressive relationship, which I know we've talked a little bit about oppression from a people of color standard. But again, I think it's so much more layered when we're dealing with abuse on different levels.
Yes. I have worked with people who experienced abuse in their childhood, and then also with people who experienced abuse in their romantic partnerships. And whether we're children or we're adults, the impact is still very similar, because it is through that intimacy, it's through that closeness and through that togetherness. Those people who are in close range to us have more access to having that influence over us, to having that impact over us. And so many times when people are going through the abuse as children, it takes a little bit more work to connect the dots and be like, this is where this belief was seated. People who are in adult relationships where they're experiencing that, it may be a little bit easier to be like, oh, yes, this actually is just the internalized voice of my partner who has been telling me that I'm unattractive, that I need to lose weight, or that I'm not good for anything. It's because the reference is more immediate. It's a little bit easier to connect those dots sometimes in our adult relationships. But then once we do, whether we're talking about abuse many years ago or abuse in the now, it still is a difficult process because the abuse is still connected to experiences of love or experiences of protection or nurturing, even though it's within the context of abuse and or neglect. And so it's something that we want to make sure we deal with compassion and with patience, but there is a lot of complexity to it because we have so many mixed emotions for these people in our lives.
Absolutely. One of the things I was thinking about as you're talking, is when people are listening to the show, right, and they're hearing this inner critic for the first time, they're hearing this discussion. If they're out there in the world, how do they know that they have a negative inner critic or that the inner critic that they have is somewhat problematic for them?
Yeah. So I would ask you, how many times in a day do you say, oh, I could have done that. I should have done that. Oh, I would have done that when something happens? That's kind of like, that's the inner critic's lingo. I shoulda, coulda, woulda. And I would also ask you to pay attention to how do you respond when moments of celebration are upon you. So when you accomplish something or when you complete a project, how do you typically respond? Are you able to like give yourself a pat on the back and be like, yes, I did it, and pause and really enjoy the moment and bask in that and celebrate? Or are you more kind of going back and nitpicking and saying, I could have done this better, or I should have done that, or oh my God, why didn't I do that? And so if you notice yourself or your thought patterns tend to focus on the gaps that weren't filled instead of focusing on what was, what happened, what is, then I would want to explore more deeply on the impact that the inner critic is having on your life, because then there is this emphasis and this prioritizing of criticizing all the things that didn't go right or what wasn't good enough. And then it robs us of our opportunities to be energized. It robs us of our opportunities to connect meaningfully with people we love through, rituals and moments of celebration, et cetera, et cetera. So those are like the two clues I like to start digging with.
Nice. And the other piece of it is, which we didn't talk about it yesterday, but I'm thinking about it as now. Suppose I'm on the outside looking in, right? Suppose I'm your mother, I'm your sister, somebody you work with, or just somebody you know, or somebody that cares about you, right? Mm-hmm. How, from an outside person's perspective, can I gauge a person or look at a person and say maybe they've got some inner critic issues going on and maybe they need to talk to somebody about that?
Yeah. I think it's probably most evident. It's most evident during those moments of celebration. So I'm thinking of a few clients and just a few people like in my life when we get those moments and we celebrate, there's some people who are really able to rejoice. The people who are struggling more with the inner critic, they're already either planning the next thing, rushing ahead, saying like, this is kind of really pointless. I don't see the point of you guys throwing this like party for me, or I don't see the point of having this celebration or the ceremony. We got something else to do. Let's just move on to the next thing. There's someone very close to my life. They're an athlete, so even if they would come in first place, it would still be like, oh my gosh, I could have done that better. Oh my goodness, this isn't, I could have done that 2 seconds faster, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult for them to rejoice, even when everybody else would agree. Even the trophy you received says you the best, like you came in first. And it is still difficult for them to be able to just bask in that, even for a moment, and just appreciate it and allow themselves to just sit there. It's always moving on to the next thing, or what do I need to do better? And it's an exhausting process, because there isn't time and space to rest, recover, rejuvenate, celebrate.
Absolutely. And you talked a little bit yesterday about your example. Do you want to share that again today?
Yes. Yes. That was one of my favorite moments, but yeah. So it took me a few years to name it, even though I knew through my training what the inner critic was. Yes. It took me a few years to put all the pieces together. But in my earlier years, I started noticing, okay, something's off, because when I was in high school, I'm a first generation college graduate. So it was the family pride and jewel for me to go to college, right, and for me to get a bachelor's. That was a huge thing. Like, my whole family was supporting me. It was huge. So I go, and it was just like, it was on my vision board. Like, I want to get a bachelor's. So I go, I get my bachelor's for psychology. And I'm just like, what's the point of walking the stage? Like, what's the point of graduating? Mm-hmm. I don't need to have a big party. Like, I barely even wanted to go get a graduation dress. I'm like, as I went through my bachelor's, I'm like, I can't get this type of job I want with a bachelor's. I need to go on and get my master's. So I'm like, what's the point? I'm going to do it again. I'm going right back to school next semester. Like, this is silly. And so I decided I didn't want to walk the stage. Luckily, one of my professors had a big influence in my life. So she colluded with my mother, and my mother really wanted me to have this celebration. So like, they convinced me, and I ended up walking the stage, and like, my grandparents did a little thing in their backyard for me, and all the family was there. But that was kind of like the first moment I noticed it. And then the same thing when I got my master's, and the same thing when I got my PhD. Even for my birthday, even my wedding, my husband and I did the court wedding, and we were like, I don't want to do, the whole thing with the whole family. And my mom was like, we will. And even though it was just my mom and my in-laws, like in my grandparents' basement, like they insisted, but I didn't plan it, because I was just like, what's the point? Yeah. Like, So I've always, I noticed myself shying away from all of these things that are so important in so many cultures. These moments of togetherness, these moments of celebration, these moments of bonding. And if you do so much work to get to that moment, and then when the moment comes and you finally have permission to just bask in it and celebrate and just experience joy, then I notice myself in a rush to get to the next thing. Well, we gotta do this, or the next project is this, or it's time for me to start focusing on this. And it was just this continuous like hustle that became very exhausting. And then I had my own aha moment, which is like, you are not allowing yourself to experience the full range of human emotion. It's constantly striving and never celebrating and rejuvenating and just sitting back and basking in the accomplishments that you've made. And I see this a lot with a lot of successful people as well. Like, they get that political accolade they were trying to reach, or they get that community award that they were striving for. Or when I'm working with athletes, they get those awards, they place in those places they were aiming for. And once they get there, they're not able to experience the satisfaction they were chasing so much. And that's, I started having this realization. This is the inner critic that has taken over and does not allow us to experience the full range of our human emotion.
Yeah. And this is where I had my aha moment, because with you, as I shared with you yesterday, which I have no problem sharing with the listeners, but I didn't go to any of my graduations after high school. And I have three degrees after high school. And I've always thought of it as, I don't like celebrating. I don't like these big to-dos,
Mm-hmm.
and I could see someone easily saying that I just really don't like big things, or I have so much more to do that this is, and so, as I talked with you yesterday, I shared with you also how my therapist was saying that, Black people, and it could be true for people of color in general, but this adds to another layer. They don't celebrate their wins. A lot of people have trouble celebrating. Not that no one does, but they have a lot of trouble celebrating or acknowledging their wins. And there's something in the conditioning, which is taught very early on, that you got to work harder. You gotta do more, and continue to go on. And so, as you're bringing up the celebration stuff, and you're talking about your own moments of clarity, I'm having a moment of clarity, like, damn, do I need to do some inner critic work? But I'm wondering, like, for people that are listening, how can you discern whether it's just, I'm an introvert, I don't like that kind of stuff, or
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's very, I know it, how you can tell, and that's what's making me actually reflect on my own stuff, which I love. This is one of the reasons why I love podcasting with people like yourself, because I learn so much from you. But for the layperson that's just kind of listening to you and can be sort of dismissive of that, how can they discern whether or not it is inner critic versus they're just an introvert and they don't like that kind of stuff?
Right. So one of my go-tos, my first approach I would ask them, how is it that they respond to other people's wins? So if your sister or your mother or your spouse or your best friend accomplishes something and has a win, how do you respond? Do you cook them a favorite meal? Do you say, oh, we need to celebrate this, I'm so proud of you? Do you go and buy them a card?
Yeah.
Do you try to celebrate or bookmark or ritualize the moment for them somehow, some way, right? Do you write them a meaningful letter? Like, how do you tend to respond when people you care about and when people you love experience wins in their own lives? And if you notice that, you know what, I am the one that's always like, oh no, I need to celebrate you, I need to uplift you, I need to encourage you, I need you to know how much of a big deal that is.
Yeah.
And you just have this moment to really like solidify that. If you notice that that's the case for the way you treat everybody else, then I would argue that the conditioning that has happened, as you talked about before, which has become very racialized, is that it's okay to celebrate wins as long as they're not yours. You're not deserving of wins, but everybody else
Mm,
is.
mm.
And if you notice that that's kind of a mismatch that's happening within yourself, it's a little bit more easy to reject that and be like, no, that's not even me. Because me, in my heart of hearts, I'm the first one to go out and get someone a gift.
Wow.
I'm the first one to be like, oh, we having the cookout at my house. Okay. I'm the first one to go out and go buy the balloons or
Wow.
whatever the case may be. And if you notice that that's you for everybody else, I would argue that that's who you truly are. And we just need to externalize that inner critic that has been robbing you of being able to pour and experience you within yourself. Now, if the other side of that is if you're like, I think celebration is stupid, period. Like I don't celebrate anyone else. I don't quite see the point in it. And if that's consistent, so if you're consistent
Yeah.
like that with everyone else and you're like, you don't want to celebrate, you kind of
Yeah.
think those things don't make too much sense, then it's consistent if you're treating yourself that way too. But if you treat everyone else one way and you're the only exception to the rule, I would argue there's some exploration
Okay.
and alignment and integrity that needs to happen there.
Yeah. I feel like I'm a mixture of both. I'm diagnosing myself. How do we externalize that? Like you say, if there's people that do for everyone else, but not for themselves, can you
Yeah.
share how you help people to externalize that?
Yeah. So I externalize by also practicing integrity. So we can, sometimes it's easy, well, it is easier to, before we say shoo, or before we say no, or we say cancel, we're being very clear about what we're holding on to and what we're rooting ourselves in. So I want to ensure that we're rooting ourselves in integrity, in our core principles, in our core beliefs. And we're practicing integrity with the way I show up externally, the way I treat everybody else, the way I love everybody else, the way I respect everybody else, the way I practice, compassion and kindness to everyone around me, and the way that I treat myself, and allow there to be oneness there. So if I speak to everyone this way, I'm absolutely deserving of speaking to myself in that same way. If I treat everyone with this level of respect, and I would never say the things that I say to myself to another human being, that I'm for sure going to make sure moving forward, I'm practicing integrity and I treat myself with that same level of respect. And so having that integrity, so then when we notice that voice that comes in and says, you gonna walk out the house looking like that today? Or do you think that was good enough? Or whatever the case may be, then you notice, like, that's not really me. I wouldn't say that to anybody.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna allow myself to externalize that, and when you do a little bit of exploration work, you might be able to pinpoint, maybe there was a certain person in your life that used to speak to you that way, and then you just started echoing that voice. Or sometimes it's a little bit bigger picture. Sometimes it's in the advertising that we're being bombarded with. Sometimes it's just like in the media, things along those lines. But then you could start pinpointing, where is this really coming from? Because I know I would never say that to anyone else. And so that's how the externalizing happens, like naming it and allowing it and choosing to reject it, knowing that at my core, this is how I am. This is what I believe. This is the way I treat others and myself.
That's, and as you're talking and I'm listening to you, what it sounds like, a lot of the work that's being done, it sounds almost like reparenting your inner child.
Absolutely.
And that's what it sounds like, embracing that part of you, or bringing that part of you closer to you. That's kind of what it reminds me of, which brings me to the next piece. Who is our inner critic? What is that voice comprised of?
It's multidimensional. It is comprised of our environments, of our religious standards, of our cultural and ethnic backgrounds, and of our family dynamics and our romantic partnerships. The core of it, though, and so it's I've said before, like, the inner critic is tough love gone wrong, because at the core of it, it is trying to ensure that we are accepted by the collective. It's trying to ensure that we experience success.
Right.
But the methods it uses for us to experience success, or for us to be accepted, or for us to quote unquote belong, are very critical in nature. Are, don't do that, get back in the box. If we're just being kind of slapped around in all of these different areas based on some very distorted and skewed standard of what the right answer looks like, or what perfection looks like, or what success looks like, or what has been communicated are the standards we need to follow to be accepted by the social group. That is kind of what it uses. And when we live in communities and environments where there is also so many layers of toxicity, abuse, social oppression, all of these things, then that also becomes part of our inner narrative. So it's very important to understand that there is a multidimensional aspect to it, Because if we only keep it at the individual level, then it could very easily kind of become like that victim blaming, like, oh, it's your fault you think that way, as if you created this idea all by yourself. It's being reinforced all around you. And so it's important to know that, so we could be more intentional in creating safer spaces where we're getting the messages that you are accepted exactly as you are worthy exactly as you are loved exactly as you are.
You know, and I'm writing this down, but I'm thinking about, you know, just how that sort of shapes our actions, that voice, in, you know, the toxicity of the voice. And, you know, I work with my clients a lot around just sort of that voice also, but also how that voice does the opposite of what it's trying to get us to do. So it's, you know, it's like tough love gone wrong, like you said, but I also think there's this added dimension to where's, you know, not is it just tough love gone wrong on yourself, but it's actually driving you into danger or causing you to want to conform or try to figure out ways to make yourself better for this other abusive personality.
Yes. Yeah. We lose ourselves in the process
Yeah.
because we are trying to conform to this ideal or expectation that really had room for us to begin with. It was more, what was more of the priority was this ideal or this image, not so much the existence of the complexity of who we are. And so, and we're contorting ourselves, we're minimizing ourselves, we're shaping ourselves to try to fit here. And there are some people that do get here and then they experience so much dissatisfaction. They experience depression, they experience anxiety because they're like, this isn't even who I am, but this is how I need to perform to be accepted. This is how I need to perform to be loved. And a lot of people that I've worked with who reach those kind of echelons of success then have those epiphany moments like, oh my gosh, I did all of this and now I'm here and I'm not, for what? Like this isn't satisfying. This isn't even who I am. They kind of feel constrained and confined because they had to do so much sacrificing of self to reach this point, and then feeling like I can't even be my full self now that I'm here. And so it is what you said before, that process of parenting that inner child again, practicing acceptance, practicing compassion for self, and then empowering self to be all of who we are, which is complex and multidimensional.
And I can see, you know, people often say to me they've lost themselves in their relationships, right? They don't even know who they are. And I could see how that voice, that inside voice, gets so heavily influenced by an oppressor or an abuser or just people around you in general, the industry, right? The industry makes billions of dollars telling you that you're not okay as you are. You need to look like this. Your hair needs to look like this. Your nose needs to look like this. You need to talk like this. You need to dress this way. And I feel like that's the foundation, at least of US-based culture. What that's based off of is that everywhere you turn, there's some sort of reinforcement via social media, via some sort of national platform, TV, whatever, that's telling you that you need to change or you need to do this or you're not significant unless you're doing this.
And you need something outside of yourself to be accepted or to be worthy or to experience the emotions you want to experience, when we have access to all of it already in the right now. And it's more about learning how to tap into that and being in spaces that nurture that. But those aren't the messages we get. We get the messages that you need to do this thing or you need to have this external thing to access a part of you that's already inside of you anyways, to access that joy or that satisfaction or that passion or that confidence or that ecstasy. And so it's kind of pulling us outside of ourselves
Wow.
to experience something that's inside already.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the other the other question I have is, and I feel like I've sort of kind of answered this, but I also feel like, it's if it can be very complicated when you're being abused or oppressed to
Mm-hmm.
sort of um like, I don't know, how do people like come to an aha moment? Like you talked about yourself, but when you have these layers and you're still with an abuser or you're still in an oppressive environment, and that oppressive environment could be prison, it could be your job, it could be living at your mother's house, it could be wherever, where you still have all that negative energy. How do you sort of step back and have an aha moment and say, you know what, something's got to change?
Yeah. Yeah. I like really emphasizing that integrity itself and bringing back into, okay, let me at least have a state of calmness within my own skin, a state of certainty within my skin. What is it that I know to be true? What is it that I believe? And just have clarity and peace of mind about that. Once we're able to establish that, then there's kind of like a barrier that we're able to create. Let's say if we're living with a very critical mother and she's like, you sure you should be getting a second plate of food? Or are you coming home with at this time of night? What were you doing with that person or whatever the case may be? Then
Yeah.
if you already know within yourself and you have a state of understanding and certainty that um, I am perfectly okay as I am, and I will nourish my body the way that I know it needs to be
Sure.
nourished. I have acceptance of self, et cetera, et cetera. When you hear that message, then it allows you to be like, oh, there's mom. She's trying to project her judgment onto me. She's trying to project her body image standards onto me. She's trying to project her that critical nature onto me, and I choose to reject it.
Mm.
And that's just one way we could do that, just psychologically. Like, no, I'm not going to allow that to reside in my mind no more than a second. Like, I am beautiful as I am. I am perfectly okay if I choose to have another plate. Like, I barely ate today anyways, and I'm hungry, and I'm going to honor my body. And then also there's another layer we can do, which is practice that boundary work. Once we have a sense of confidence within ourselves, then we know where to set up our boundaries. And so I like helping my clients kind of create one sentence statements that work in the different environments they're in. So if it's with mom, coming up with that like one sentence statement that we're going to say when she brings up a conversation that you're like, okay, we're not talking about this topic anymore. Like, I no longer give you permission to talk to me about my body image or how much weight I'm gaining or losing. Or if it's at work and a supervisor is crossing professional boundaries, having that statement prepared. I do not feel comfortable having this conversation right now, or I'm going to come back, in an hour or whatever the case may be. But just kind of having those sentences that we agree feel natural and are appropriate based on the relationship and environment, so that it's easier to at least put up those verbal boundaries when boundaries are crossed, and just allowing yourself to practice assertive communication in those ways as well.
That's, I agree spot on with you in terms of, being assertive and practicing boundaries. And I think, as we talked about, oh gosh, I hope you can't hear him. There's the rooster again. And, outside my window, he's
I just heard like a little bit, but I didn't
Can
know
you?
it was a
Okay,
rooster.
God,
It
he
was
drives
it
me
was just like half
insane.
a second.
I swear he makes an appearance now. But what I was gonna say is, you talked about practicing boundaries with the critic, that's part of your inner critic when they're still breathing and still in that space. I'm wondering, because I also work with a lot of clients where their inner critic, or that voice that helps shape the large part of their inner critic, is deceased or they're gone. or they no longer have a relationship with them, right? And, people who might leave an abusive relationship or something like that, where they were significantly abused and they're no longer with that person, but that person's voice is still part of their inner critic. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how we would work with someone, or someone would work with that, where they're just kind of breathing life into a critic that no longer exists physically, but is they're kind of carrying it with them mentally?
Yeah. Um, releasing is a big part of it. And I also, I like, with some people are okay with this.
Yeah.
Some people are just more, talking is better, but with some people I like bringing like a physical layer to it too, so that there's kind of like that symbolic process of us externalizing these messages in this person's voice and releasing it in that way. So one client I was working with, there were a lot of, this person was no longer in his life, but had a very abusive impact on him.
Mm.
And it was still affecting him now in his adult married life.
Yeah.
And we ended up using like a tissue box, and the box was representative of the client. All the tissues inside were representative of all of the messages and experiences that he was forced to go through. And then we went through this process where he got to choose, which ones am I choosing to take out of this box? Which ones am I choosing to release? And then assigning those thoughts, beliefs, ways of remembering certain moments to this particular person in his life, and saying, you're gone and you're taking this with you. I'm no longer holding on to your abuse for you. I'm no longer holding on to your incapacity to love for you. I'm no longer holding on to this hatred for you. That was yours. It was never mine to begin with. And you can take it, you can take it with you.
Right.
And just like releasing it and acknowledging, this was never mine to begin with. It was this person projecting all of their pain, all of their incapacity onto me. And I no longer want to hold their weight. And then releasing it and giving it back to the source, giving it back to the person that it came from. Another layer and practice that I do, depending on how appropriate it is for the situation, is allowing compassion to come in and play a role as well. Sometimes, not all the time, sometimes it is appropriate to have compassion for the person and understand that the person was kind of what we talked about before, kind of that tough love gone wrong. They were preparing me for what their experience of the world was like. They believed that in this world, it was very harsh. It was very critical. And the only way that we were going to be able to survive it is if we knew how to handle this level of criticism, or if we knew how to handle this amount of insults, or if we knew how to have the tough skin that they believed that we needed to be able to survive their experience of what life was like. And sometimes that's what they're putting onto us, not knowing, even though their intent is to prepare us for this harsh world, what they were doing was abusive. What they were doing was debilitating. And sometimes it's appropriate to understand that it doesn't give them a get out of jail free card, because it was still abusive, it was still hurtful. But sometimes it is helpful to understand that the place this was coming from, it was distorted along the way, but the place it was coming from was them trying to share the armor that they had to build in their lifetime with us. And luckily for me, my experience of life is different. My experience of relationship is different. My experience of sexuality is different. I'm able to experience safety for real. I'm able to experience community. I'm able to experience authentic bonding and intimacy. And for that, I am grateful. And I'm no longer choosing to subscribe to what their experience of life was like. And I'm not, we don't want to dismiss it, that was what their experience was, but we know that it can be different, and we're choosing to have a life where we experience more of that difference. So those are a couple of approaches I like using.
Nice. Yeah. And it sounds a lot like, grief is involved in some of that,
Oh,
the first
absolutely.
exercise, letting go of, the person you thought they would be and the person they actually were, and just letting them go from you in general, So I appreciate you saying that. As you're talking, I'm wondering, a lot of people may struggle with inner critic work, but I'm also wondering if there's a type of person in your experience that struggles with it the most,
Hmm.
or a type of personality, because I know as therapists, we're very empathic people, right? And as empathic people, or most of us are anyway, some of us are questionable. Just kidding. But
But for real.
but we're taught to, absorb a lot from people. And I feel like that's for most of us that go into this field, that happens way before then. And so
Mhm.
empathic people are typically very sensitive and they take on a lot of stuff. Um, but I don't know from your expertise and all you work with in inner critic work, if you feel like there's people that are more prone to it or have taken a lot more of it or have deeper layers of it,
Mhm.
maybe even, or it can be
Yeah,
tougher for them to sort of work through this.
absolutely. One point, I've even with that empathic part, what I've noticed in my work is that people who are able to access those depths of empathy, typically it's because of negative experiences they had early on in life where they were forced to learn those skills
Mm-hmm.
early on for survival. And then luckily there's a group of people who learn to use it in a way that's healing and uplifting. Um, and the same is true. What I've observed from my work with inner critic work, when as children, we either have a person in some authority. So whether it is a parent or whether it is a sibling or whether it's someone that's just very close to the family and influential, and that person is serving as the critical one, whether it is more
Mm-hmm.
psychological abuse or if it's physical abuse or sexual abuse, but when at an early age and it's someone inside of our inner circle that is serving as that main
Yeah.
source, I've noticed it becomes difficult for the person to develop their own sense of knowing and know how to filter.
Mm.
A lot of other people, when we have those childhood experiences of our inner circle being uplifting or encouraging or confidence building, then we have that one of those protective factors and being able to buffer all of the messages we're going to get from other social circles. So from our schools, from some of those, almost everyone has a oh, my teacher didn't believe in me
Yes.
story, right? But when we have our inner circle at home, that's like, you're smart, I know you can do this, you can overcome, then we have that buffer to be able to filter when we're having those negative experiences in school and teachers are telling us
Mm-hmm.
that we won't be able to, amount to anything, or when we may be being bullied in school
Yeah.
for looking a certain way or having a certain complexion or whatever the case may be. If we have that inner circle at home where we are loved exactly as we are, when we're supported, then we have that protective barrier to help us filter that. The people who I've noticed struggle the most with the inner critic are the people who didn't have that protective barrier
Mm-hmm.
enclosed or created in their earlier years of life, because they were not only experiencing it from the outer layers of social circles, but they also experienced it in their core layer.
Yeah.
And that takes more healing and repair. And like we were talking about before, more of that inner child healing and reparenting work, because there's that intimacy has more access to deeper wounds.
Beautifully said and put. And I guess my last question for you is systemically. as we talked about before, when we have these messages from society coming at us from all different angles, how can we, I guess, form a protective barrier or navigate that much more? Um, I don't know if sensibly is the right word, but I want to say it in a way that, like, we could just navigate that without internalizing
Yeah,
all of those messages that society gives us. Is that possible?
absolutely. And there's so much power in naming. So one of my favorite things of like just my own journey was like how my vocabulary expanded. I was like, ooh, that looks like patriarchy. Ooh, that looks like racism. Ooh, that looks like, capitalism. Not that capitalism is all bad, but sometimes it kind of puts us in that place where profit means more than
Yeah.
anything else.
Yep.
And so just being able to have the vocabulary and name things, and when you're even noticing your own thoughts or your own motives to make different decisions, pay attention to what is driving this. Am I being driven by my core values right now? Or am I being driven by the pressures in this workspace?
Yes.
Am I being driven by the pressures to look a certain way or have a certain body type or whatever the case may be? So as we learn more and more how to name things, then it's easier to externalize them, because it's like, no, that's not me. I believe this. I believe this is beautiful, or this is worthy, or this is valuable. That looks like this. And once we're able to name things, then we're able to reject them with more ease and really ground ourselves in the truth of our experience.
Nice. Nicely put. And I appreciate you coming on and explaining this so beautifully. Dr. D, I know that people are going to love you. So tell us how we can find you and what sort of wonderful things you've been working on and what you got for us.
So I am most active on Instagram. If you're on Instagram, please follow me there. My handle is at dr.dthemft. That's at dr.d, the MFT. You can also just use that handle and put it in Google. You'll find me there on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook,
Nice.
and my website is resilientliving.info.
Nice.
For your listeners, I am also offering a 50% off intensive package. And what that is I have a workbook. So if you just like self-help, you can find the workbook on my website. But if you want to go a little bit deeper and assess how your own cultural backgrounds or family of origin things have had an influence on the inner critic, and,
Nice.
and want a little bit of that support, then just let me know you heard me on this podcast, and I will honor that 50% discount. And I would love to dive deep with you in that session, and then we'll have follow up for a month afterwards.
That sounds great. And do you have time to show us a little bit of that? The stuff that you're offering?
Sure.
Let me make sure you could share, because
Yes,
I
I
want people to
can.
see. Awesome.
Okay. So if you're watching, you'll be able to see it. If you're listening, I'm just showing the cover of my workbook. It's a 30-day writing journey that's going to guide you in neutralizing the inner critic, transforming your self-talk, and increasing your emotional intelligence. The goal of this is to allow your inner voice to become the nicest voice you hear.
Nice.
And NICE is the acronym I use to walk my clients through this. So the N stands for nurturing self-talk. The I is integrity. We talked about that a lot today. The C is the celebrating, the compassion, the complimenting of self. And then the E stands for the emotional intelligence work that we dive into. And so I have assessments, we have ground rules, and then I share the interventions that I use for each of the steps.
Okay. Nice. Can you give us an example of a writing prompt? Are you willing to share, like, or just like say, talk about maybe a general, without, I don't want you to give too much of your product away, because I think it's juicy, but I want people to get a little nibble of what they're gonna.
Okay. So this is just like day one example. So what's your nurturing self-talk of the day? And then there's a section that shows you like little templates you can use to create your nurturing self-talk. And then how did you practice integrity with that self-talk? So if my self-talk of the day was, I am compassionate, then what are some compassionate things I did today? How are we going to build integrity with that today? Committing to the ground rules. So that includes no could-haves, no should-haves, no would-haves. And then we talk about how to kind of go in the past and not do it with that critical layer that the inner critic likes to do, but go and find the gems.
Nice.
So you could bring it back to the present moment. And so that's how we do that. We practice compassion, and then daily giving ourselves a compliment. Because if the inner critic has been in charge, you are many times a day insulting yourself. So we need to balance that out with providing a compliment. And then what emotions did you feel today? And then there are several emotional intelligence exercises, because my belief is every emotion, whether it is positive or negative, it can be processed in a way that serves your health and well-being. So we use those emotional intelligence exercises to, even if we're feeling angry, or even if we're feeling jealous, or even if we're feeling sad, it's a messenger trying to communicate something of value to us, to uplift us. And we take the time out every day to figure out what that is, so that we can continue to grow and empower ourselves through our range of emotions.
Okay, cool. And what about the intensive? Anything you could show us from there, or is that just all kind of online?
Yeah, so the intensive is more what we do in dialogue, because it's a one-on-one thing. So
I love it. And I will be sure to put all of your information, including your social media handles, in the show notes so people can have that and access that. And I so appreciate you coming on to share all of this with us.
Thank you for having me.
And twice, I might add. All right. Thank you so much. Okay, so you heard the interview. Love to know what your thoughts are. And as always, if you think that other people can benefit from this, I think sharing is caring. So making sure that you like, share, comment, view the video, share it with a colleague, a friend, someone that you think could benefit it. I would greatly appreciate it. And I greatly appreciate you. So thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, be well, stay safe.